Archons are known to be some of the strongest characters in Genshin Impact, both in lore and gameplay. With the 5th Archon slowly approaching, let's break down which out of the 4 existing gods you should pull for. How's it going, everyone? This is Kay, and I'll break down the strengths and weaknesses of Venti, Zhongli, Raiden Shogun, and Nahida to determine which one you should prioritize getting when we have their eventual rerun banners. Starting with the Animal Archon, as we all know, Venti is known for his superior crowd control with his elemental burst. This is most vital to handle multiple waves of enemies, but before that, he's meant to enhance the team's elemental damage because you will be using the Verdescent 4-piece, which shreds elemental resistance of the element you swirled with. Not only that, his A4 passive will recharge 15 energy for himself and for all teammates with the same element that was absorbed by his burst. What makes Venti perfect is that he is the definition of a quick swap character. Use his E, then burst and swap out, no time wasted. His CC, low fill time, and Verdescent makes him splashable into almost any teams. Now, there are 2 ways to build Venti: a full EM build or the traditional animal crit damage build. Simply put, Elemental Mastery is easier to build since all you really want is EM main artifacts with some ER substats. You don't really have to worry about balancing crit stats, but EM artifacts are a pain in the ass to get. With an EM build, his damage will come from swirl reactions and will typically be better for multi-target situations, which is the reason why you would use Venti in the first place. If you cannot swirl, then his damage will just give chicken scratches to enemies. A crit build can yield higher damage, especially in single target battles, but the build can be pretty demanding. Regardless, it's the traditional DPS build, you know, attack percentage, animo, and crit artifacts. Venti can benefit a lot from supports like Farzan or Bennett if you're going for a crit build. Since Venti's constellations can shred animo resistance and can buff his own, crit builds will synergize a little bit better with his constellation, especially if you want to see big animo numbers. Now, Venti must access his burst every rotation, meaning ER is very important. Thankfully, his Ascension stats provides ER. Generally, you'll want to have around 170% ER. A little bit more doesn't hurt. You could have less if you can use his E skill twice for energy, which is possible. Tap E skill before his burst, and then after 6 seconds, switch back to Venti to use E skill again. Doing so may force you out of a specific rotation combo, so it really depends on your team. It's important to remember his burst lifting effect is determined by his level compared to enemies. Higher levels for Venti means he can possibly lift them up, which can be out of attack range for some characters. This is why some players leave him at level 70, but just know Swirl scales with Venti's level as well, meaning less damage if you neglect him. Now, being the first Archon, especially when the game was still new, means he has several weaknesses. He is a CC god, meaning if enemies can't be sucked into his animal vortex, then Venti's role will be severely weakened. What's worse is if enemies move out of the vortex. This means Venti is not suited for all types of battles, where there are a lot of enemies, even bosses, that can avoid his burst. That is why Venti's usage rate in Abyss has decreased throughout several updates. On top of that, a well-known nitpick about Venti is that his burst aiming kinda sucks a bit. This is because he will target the nearest enemy and not necessarily where you're facing. Sometimes he will fire off away from the mob of enemies if the nearest enemy so happens to be next to him. So positioning before his burst is very important. I already mentioned this, but some characters cannot hit enemies who are sucked into Venti's burst. It's simply out of reach, and that can pose a problem for some team builds. Regardless of some faults though, Venti is great, especially in the open world, where you'll encounter mobs of enemies more frequently, and his E skill can be used to climb those damn cliffs. Next is the great Morax himself and my personal favorite Archon. Where Venti is the best crowd control unit in the game, Zhongli is the best shielder in the game. First of all, his shield can tank a lot of damage when building him with HP artifacts. Not to mention, if you give him the 3-star Black Tassel polearm, even the Staff of Homa, that's even more HP for Zhongli, and his A1 passive makes his Jade shield even stronger when taking damage. The best thing about Zhongli is that his shield has 100% uptime. The Jade shield lasts 20 seconds on a 12-second cooldown, giving you plenty of time to go through your rotations and then swap back to him to reapply the shield. Shielding is one of the best mechanics in Genshin Impact. For one, you won't need a healer since you're not taking damage, unless you're facing corrosion type enemies, in which case Geodaddy ain't the best option. So aside from those wolves, no damage, but most importantly Additionally, no interruptions. Some characters like Yoimiya and most infamously the puppet with the god complex can get knocked over by a slight breeze. With shields, especially a shield from Zhongli, means your characters can go ham on enemies without any worry of dying, dodging, or getting knocked back, which can save you a lot of time in Abyss. Now, despite Zhongli not having the best damage, his usage in Abyss remains very high due to how convenient his shield is. But that's not all. His Jade shield can shred 20% elemental and physical resistance on enemies, resulting in more team damage overall. As you know, he summons a Geo Pillar that deals small AoE damage, but don't really rely on this too much as enemies can destroy the pillar, but it does provide a nice low damage that can also block some projectiles if necessary. It works great with the Millilith 4-piece for additional team support, but having only one Geo structure can lead to some consistency issues. That's why having a C1 Zhongli is beneficial, since he can have two Geo Pillars at the same time. Other Geo structures like Albedo's E or GMC can be used as well. Zhongli's Meteor Attack or E-Burst will be his primary way to deal damage, but depending on his build, it's used as a secondary attack when you have the time or if you're waiting on cooldowns. Otherwise, it can lead to some DPS loss over time due to the animation time and mediocre damage. But hey, it looks cool and the petrification can give you breathing room or stop moving targets. Generally, most players will use him as a shield bot, so all HP stats or a burst support, which is a hybrid that focuses on some HP but mainly increasing his burst damage. This would lead you to using HP Sands, Geo Goblet, and Crit Headpiece. This hybrid build can still offer good shielding while dealing decent damage. Both builds are effective in their own ways, but the hybrid burst is best for early content because there's very few enemies that can really break his shield early on, so you might as well just up his damage. But for late game, especially in Abyss, enemies can easily shatter his shield, so you want to stack HP stats. But you'll just have to find your own sweet spot and adjust his stats accordingly. So aside from Zhongli's mid damage, lack of strong elemental reactions, and poor energy generation, he's very boring to use for some people. Create his shield, then switch out. That's generally it. I mean, you can build a physical DPS Zhongli for fun, or use him in a Geo Mono team to create multiple Geo structures to shockwave enemies to death, which is pretty fun in itself, but the shield is the heart and soul of Zhongli's kit. Before we continue, as a gacha gamer who spends a questionable amount of time and money on digital characters, I take internet security very seriously. This video has been done in collaboration with NordVPN. With NordVPN's next generation encryption, your online traffic data is protected. But what I especially like is NordVPN's threat protection feature, which adds a layer of security I can rely on to protect my devices and accounts. With a simple click, it protects you from malicious websites, malware, intrusive ads, trackers, even potentially infected files from downloads. What's great is that threat protection will work even when you're not connected to a VPN server. Listen, as a Genshin Impact player, one of the worst feelings is seeing all of your characters, weapons, and hard-earned artifacts be stolen from you. Unfortunately, many players even till this day lose their accounts to hackers, which has been a huge problem. You obviously want to follow basic internet safety guidelines, but having that extra security puts my mind at ease, especially if you're like me who uses public Wi-Fi frequently throughout the day. So go to nordvpn.com/keycaldea to get your 2-year plan, which includes 4 extra months for free. Keep in mind this offer is risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, go to nordvpn.com/keycaldea to claim your offer. The Raiden Shogun excels in electro application, team battery, burst damage support, all while having decent damage herself. So let's first talk about why she can be a great electro enabler, even driver within teams. Just tapping her E skill, Shogun will for 25 seconds cast a coordinated electro attack whenever your team hits an enemy. This applies to on and off field characters. The trigger rate is 1 coordinated attack every 0.9 second for the party. What's great is that the skill only has a 10-second cooldown, so it's a 100% uptime ability, allowing constant electro damage. Because of the slower elemental infusion, her electro can be amazing for triggering hyper bloom reactions, and is the reason why many players use the Shogun for an all-EM build for hyper blooms. She's also a consistent enabler for superconducts, often being the default ally for Eula teams. Of course, you have the famous Raiden national team, one of the best variations of the national team that is used even till this day to clear hard content. Now, her skill does not snapshot, so it's usually best to use her skill at the start of battle. Her elemental skill also buffs everyone's burst damage, including herself and off-field characters. The buff is based on the individual's energy cost, but this is yet another reason why why using her skill first is recommended, unlike her elemental burst, which should always be used as the final attack within a rotation. Elemental Burst does an initial attack, dealing a lot of damage, then transforms all her attacks to Electro for 7 seconds. These attacks are considered burst damage, so increasing her normal attack talent does not increase damage, but her sword attacks restores energy upon hitting enemies. Battery recharge rates is every second, but you can only trigger the recharge 5 times for each burst. So basically, you're recharging up to 12.5 energy to everyone at talent level 10. This doesn't include her A4 passive, which increases her electro damage and energy restoration based on her ER stats. Basically, every 1% above 100% on her ER stats, Shogun's electro damage increases by 0.4% and energy restoration adds 0.6% for her burst. Here's the formula. Typically, you'll have her burst talent at level 10, so 2.5 recharge per hit, and the number of procs, which means how many times you'll trigger the effect, which will usually be 5, which is also the max. The more ER you have on the Shogun, the better the battery effect, but if you don't have her engulfing lightning weapon, Shogun will typically lose out on personal damage if you're using an ER Sans as opposed to attack percentage, but even if you don't have her signature polearm, ER offers burst consistency, which is what you want and is a requirement for the Raiden Shogun. So I always recommend ER, even as it sacrifices some personal damage, but honestly, it's up to you. Now, her burst actually increases in damage based on resolve stacks, which can be acquired by using other characters' bursts. Her A1 passive also adds 2 stacks when you get orbs or particles, and that effect can occur once every 3 seconds. Shogun can have a max of 60 stacks, and because of this, she can hit pretty hard even at C0. But if you want to see really big purple numbers, get her at C2. The combination of her elemental application, battery, and personal damage makes the Raiden Shogun one of the best characters in the game. In terms of Abyss usage, she has always remained on the top, but she isn't perfect. Outside of Hyper Blooms, her burst is everything, and this includes majority of her damage. This also forces you to use Shogun on field, which may or may not synergize well with other DPS characters, even if you are using Shogun as a hyper carry. Her damage at C0, though decent, can be lower compared to other main DPS units. We finally have Nahida, who has one of the best Dendro applications in the game. Because of this, most players will either use her as an off-field enabler or an on-field driver, since you'll naturally stack EM artifacts on her. As you know, her elemental skill has a tap and hold button. Holding it lets you mark up to 8 enemies, making her quite useful when fighting groups of enemies. Enemies who are marked are linked together and will get hit by her Tri-Karma whenever you trigger a reaction on them, or if they're hit by Dendro Cores, which includes Hyperbloom and Burgeon. Tri-Karma is Nahida's main source of damage and is further strengthened by her A4 passive. You basically want to increase her Elemental Mastery stats because for every EM point above 200 will increase damage by 0.1% and crit rate by 0.03% for her Tri-Karma attack. To maximize her A4 passive, you'll need 1000 EM, giving you 80% bonus damage and 24% crit rates, which is her skill's limit. The general rule is to aim for a minimum of 800 EM, but this honestly depends on what you want her to do. Now, what makes her elemental skill amazing is that the ability has 100% uptime. It lasts for 25 seconds and has a 6-second cooldown. This means enemies who are marked will always have Dendro status on them as long as you trigger reactions or reapply the skill when necessary. Tri-Karma triggers every 2.5 seconds with no ICD, but the interval can decrease thanks to her burst. Nahida's elemental burst changes in effect based on what elements you have on your team. Pyro buffs her Tri-Karma damage, Electro decreases the Karma's interval, which allows her skill to trigger faster, and Hydro increases the burst duration. Having 2 of the same elements will increase the buff. Her elemental burst goes hand in hand with her A1. The passive skill will increase the on-field character's elemental mastery stats by 25% based on whoever has the highest EM stats within the team. This means if Nahida does not have the highest EM, but let's say Shinobu does, then the scaling will be based on Shinobu, not Nahida. Max buff is 250, and this can apply to Nahida herself if she's on the field, which is another reason why she can be a strong driver. The biggest weakness for Nahida is that she's forced to be on field to mark enemies with her skill in order to apply the Dendro. This becomes a hassle against multiple wave battles where after a group of enemies are wiped out, you'll need to switch back to Nahida, therefore affecting potential rotations. So in comparison to DMC for example, where he drops a plant that can infuse Dendro to all enemies, even new ones as long as they enter the AoE, even Baiju's Dendro attacks follows your characters around and will infuse the element until his burst ends. But all Dendro characters has their pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses. DMC and Baiju relies heavily on their burst, while Nahida does not. Not to mention, Dendro application is far more powerful and consistent on Nahida. If you really want to wreck enemies, get her at C2 if you can. Dendro type reactions like burn and different bloom reactions can potentially crit. Only a 20% chance to crit with 100% crit damage, but this will increase damage overall by a lot. Quicken, spread, and aggravate will debuff enemies' defense by 30%, so if you got the money, 100% would recommend C2 Nahida. So the question becomes, which Archon should you pull for? In terms of strictly gameplay, top priorities should be either Nahida or the Raiden Shogun. Those two are like the golden standards for high damage and clearing endgame content, which is usually just Abyss. Now, if you can only choose one between Raiden Shogun or Nahida, I know it's a tough choice, but this will ultimately depend on your teams and preferred playstyle. If you are using or planning on using Dendro reactions a lot, Nahida 100% is a must-have, as she is the best Dendro character we have at the moment. She's not perfect by any means, especially for multiple wave battles, which I mentioned before, but it's more so a minor hassle. Her high off-field damage, constant Dendro application, EM-focused builds, and strong EM buff makes her very versatile in terms of all forms of Dendro teams. So Hyper Blooms, Burgeon, Nilou Blooms, quicken reactions on both sides, either spread, which will increase her damage as well, but she's vital for aggravate thanks to her long-lasting Dendro application. The Raiden Shogun, on the other hand, is more so for on-field use. That's how you'll deal damage with her, and that's how she'll charge energy for the whole entire team. You'll typically use off-field sub-DPS characters with Shogun, but she can offer some support with constant Electro application. Hyper Blooms and Electro Charge teams will be consistent with her, and Raiden will really help physical teams with triggering Superconduct. Aside from those, Shogun has team versatility in her own way. The main selling point for Raiden is her damage and battery, so she is a better fit within Geo and Animo teams compared to Nahida. She will even fit into Aggravate teams, but there are usually better options. Main issue with Raiden is that she doesn't work entirely well with other on-field carries aside from a few like Eula. This is because you'll be fighting over field time. So between the two, Nahida is focused on reactions and Shogun focuses on team burst spamming. I would recommend going for Nahida by a very paper thin margin, and I'm talking about like a 1% difference over Shogun. What Nahida offers for Dendro teams is too great to miss, but if you don't use Dendro a lot, clear answer is the Raiden Shogun above the other Archons, but we're not done yet. Zhongli is the best shielder in the game, 100% hands down, no competition. If you are a casual player, or you're still in the beginning, Zhongli is the best unit you'll ever have. He will basically put this game on easy mode. Reason why Nahida and Raiden Shogun is above Zhongli is because they surpass him in damage by a lot and they're better for reactions. And for time events like Abyss, the goal is to kill enemies as fast as possible. But Zhongli is still being used a lot in Abyss because he offers that protection and interruption resistance, which allows you to focus solely on attacking, and that in itself can save a lot of time. The last Archon to prioritize is Venti. Now this does not mean he sucks, he's actually quite amazing, but among the current Archons, we have Nahida, who is one of the best reaction-focused character, Shogun, who is one of the best battery/DPS character, and Zhongli, who is the best shielder. Venti is the best CC character, but in scenarios where crowd control is not necessary, he will fall short. But if there's ever a need to destroy waves upon waves of enemies, Venti is the Archon for the job. Comment down below to let me know which Archon you'll go for during the rerun. If you already have all four, then which Archon do you use the most? Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for future Genshin Impact videos. Good luck on all your pulls, everyone. Till next time.